Several hundred men braved bitter cold temperatures to mark the end of an ordeal few people thought possible, the completion of the 1,500-mile.
The building of the Alaska Highway represented one of the great triumphs of the U.S. Army.
A high-profile, high-energy, big, dynamic project that said, we'll do anything we have to do to defend North America.
Born out of the shock of Pearl Harbor, the Alaska Highway was a first step in America's defense strategy, a vital military supply line during World War II. Over 10,000 Army engineers were rushed to the far Northwest. Their mission was to blaze a road to Alaska in less than a year. They battled mountains, muskeg, and mosquitoes on a front that stretched across miles and miles of rugged subarctic terrain.
We were in wilderness. That's where the road was. Wilderness. Uncharted. Nobody had been there before.
We kept the tractors going as much as we could. Yeah, it was tough.
It was actually a fight for survival against the weather.
For a brief moment, their heroic efforts uplifted a nation in need of good news. But soon, other war stories overshadowed the triumph in the North, and the victory was quickly forgotten.
American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
How do you get a weed-free lawn, a healthy garden, a home that's pest-free? Every day we work to find new and better solutions. Ortho, proud to support the American Experience on PBS.
At Liberty Mutual Insurance, we do everything we can to help prevent accidents and make America a safer place. Liberty Mutual is proud to support American Experience.
American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
December 1941. 30-year-old Ruth Gruber, a journalist from New York, was on a fact-finding expedition for the U.S. Secretary of the Interior to help promote Alaska Territory. 8 months into her far-flung travels, Gruber found herself a part of an urgent military mission in the Bering Sea.
I was on a Coast Guard cutter. We were searching for Japanese fishing canneries that we suspected were spying when word came that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. And it was really a frightening moment. We didn't know how soon the Japanese would decide it was time to attack Alaska.
We are now in this war. So far, the news has been all bad. We have learned that our hemisphere is not immune from severe attack, that we cannot measure our safety in terms of miles on any map anymore.
In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Americans feared that Japan's march across the Pacific would continue to the west coast of North America.
People who thought they were secure, who thought, in fact, the World War was never going to affect them directly, all of a sudden now are living with the realization that the bombs could come the next day, that the next Pearl Harbor could be Vancouver, it could be San Francisco, it could be Los Angeles.
Alaska sat particularly vulnerable. The territory's Aleutian Islands were only 750 miles from Japan's closest military base.
The Aleutian Islands stretched out invitingly toward a shrewd and daring enemy. And Jackson, Alaska would be a direct threat to the west coast of America and also to the interior.
At the beginning of 1942, the United States had some 20,000 troops stationed across Alaska. Of the Army's 12 bombers and 20 fighters, only half were ready to meet an attack.
Alaska's defenses were woeful. The officer commanding the Alaska Defense Command was sending wires back to Washington saying, if the Japanese come here, I can't defend Alaska. I don't have the resources.
As a quick solution, the Army Air Force rushed 2 squadrons of bombers and fighters to the territory by way of the Northwest staging route. The series of airfields in northwest Canada were designed to ferry military aircraft and supplies from the lower 48 to Alaska Territory.
The airfields were in a very primitive state of construction, and not all of them were operational. The combination of lack of navigation aids, untrained pilots, bad weather, and bad luck resulted in most of those planes crashing before they got to Alaska. It was a real fiasco.
For the Americans, it became an immediate and pressing issue. What do we do to defend Alaska? It was extremely vulnerable. Very quickly, the idea of a highway to Alaska emerged as a major element in the entire North American strategy for the defense of the far Northwest.
On February 11th, just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt approved the construction of a highway to Alaska. With sea lanes under attack and air passage unreliable, the Secretary of War declared that a land route to Alaska was imperative from the viewpoint of national defense. Military planners decided to connect the air bases of the Northwest staging route.
Roosevelt certainly saw a need to secure an air corridor to Alaska. And that's what the highway was primarily designed to support.
The decision meant that the road would have to be blazed across 1,500 miles of remote subarctic wilderness and through the rugged Canadian Rockies.
The terrain had not been mapped, and it would be like going from Washington, D.C. to Denver, Colorado with no maps. You just kind of knew about where it was, and in the process, you're building a road.
The War Department snapped into action, assigning the monumental job to the Army Corps of Engineers. The order was deceptively simple. Build a road to Alaska as fast as possible and before the arrival of the next winter, about 8 months away. The Corps rushed over 10,000 men north on troop trains, loaded with some of the 250,000 tons of equipment, materials, and supplies the mission would require. The battle plan called for 7 engineering regiments. 3 would be made up of African-American soldiers. Once in place, the engineers would attack the wilderness from several fronts, joining the long road section by section. It was a hastily conceived plan hatched in Washington by officers with no experience working in Arctic regions.
The American government had to reassure the people of North America that the continent was safe, and that putting a couple more ships on the West Coast wasn't going to do it. They needed a high-profile, high-energy, big, dynamic project that said, we'll do anything we have to do to defend North America.
Now, a key part of protecting Alaska would fall to soldiers armed not with tanks, but with bulldozers.
There were people who said this can't be done, certainly not in a year. There was no certainty that they would find a buildable route through the Rockies. They didn't know whether they could get it through or not. They really did not know.
In March, the engineers began arriving in the far north. As his ship pulled into Prince William Sound, Hayward Aubrey, a university-trained artist from New Orleans, caught sight of Alaska.
When you first behold the beauty in nature in Alaska, you are overwhelmed. It was in April, the snow was on the ground. I had my parka on, and I said, praise God, I've never seen a landscape so beautiful.
John Bolin had quit his dry cleaning job in Virginia to enlist in the Army.
Our first look at Alaska was in Skagway. To see a mountain close up and to go up it, it's a thrill of a lifetime. And you get to wherever you think the top is, and there's more snow up there than you ever seen.
For other soldiers, like Henry Geyer, a truck driver from Pittsburgh, the first day hinted at hardships to come.
It was 30, 40 below zero, and you were going from California, Fort Ord, and that kind of weather up into snow and ice, and so it was no picnic.
First day we were there, our food was freezing in our mess kits, and we had to unload the train. The trains were coming in with supplies and people. From there on in, it was just struggle and organizing.
Fred Mims, a South Carolina bus driver before the war, served as a lieutenant in the Quartermaster Corps attached to the highway project. In charge of supplying the troops, the Quartermaster Corps had issued effective cold weather gear like down sleeping bags, fur parkas, and lambskin caps. But the rubber boots and woolen gloves the soldiers got were no match for the extreme cold. There were many cases of badly frozen feet, reported one officer. Tractor operators were found along the roads sitting by their parked equipment and crying violently. So great was the cold. Most of the soldiers sent to the north had a lot to learn about road building. Chester Russell from Kingsburg, California, who had worked the rodeo circuit before being drafted, suddenly was told he would be driving a 19-ton D8 bulldozer.
I ended up as a swamper, what they call a swamper on a D8. A D8 tractor, I'd never seen one before. At 21 years old, and I wasn't prepared, I'll guarantee you. I'll guarantee I wasn't prepared.
The units that served on the Alaskan Highway had less experience with the heavy equipment than would have been desirable. So they had some on-the-job training to do in difficult circumstances.
I got assigned to the maintenance of the bulldozers, and my first actual experience with the bulldozers was after we got there. My degree was in metallurgical engineering. I was more comfortable with a microscope in a laboratory than I was with a bulldozer or some of the other tools of highway building.
My responsibility was to take care of the heavy equipment. Most of the equipment I had never seen. Being an asphalt and concrete city boy, I didn't know nothing about this heavy equipment.
When we went up there, we learned on the job and in a hurry.
My job was to try to organize the supplies that were coming in crates. We had just mountains of big crates of canned goods. We were pretty well confused about the stuff because most of our people didn't know the difference a number 2 can of beans and a number 10 can of beans. We had to organize and find out how to do that. And it took a while to get started.
The engineers overwhelmed small towns like Dawson Creek, British Columbia, where the arrival of one regiment tripled the town's population almost overnight.
No one knew what was going on. We didn't know anything about it until the troop trains started coming and the equipment and the Army vehicles. And it was just amazing.
This is an outfit of 1,000 men, several hundred trucks, dozens and dozens of bulldozers and cranes and other pieces of heavy equipment, and literally hundreds of tons of supplies, everything from gasoline and diesel fuel to food and spare parts.
It was very exciting. There was American soldiers everywhere. It made us a great deal more aware of the war. They were building this highway to protect us. We felt very involved.
In April, shocking news from the Philippines reached the north. Nearly 80,000 American and Filipino troops had surrendered in Bataan. Officers on the highway decided to start work right away, even though they had no route through the Rocky Mountains. On April 11th, 1942, construction officially began on the Alaska Highway. Of the 11,000 men sent north, nearly 4,000 were African American. As throughout the segregated U.S. military, white and black engineers on the Alaska Highway project were kept apart. Black soldiers worked under the command of white officers. Faced with a shortage of troops after Pearl Harbor, the Secretary of War had forced the Army to assign black engineers to the mission.
The Army had a policy at the time that was based on the supposition that blacks would not function well in extreme cold climates. And so there was a kind of de facto ban on sending black units to any place like Alaska or Canada.
The employment of African American troops on the Alaska Highway was seen by some in the Army, I'm sure, as an experiment. Not everybody thought it was the best choice.
Many white officers had doubts about the character and ability of black soldiers. The Negro is careless, shiftless, irresponsible, and secretive, described a military study. He is best handled with praise and by ridicule.
This study came from the Army War College. It's a finishing school for officers who are going to have successful careers. And this is what they were being taught. And so you can imagine the kinds of stereotypes that the officers entered this experience with and how difficult it was for the black troops.
In the minds of most senior white officers, black troops were not as capable in terms of their technical efficiency and ability to use the equipment. There was an expectation that they would do poorly.
While it today sounds very prejudiced, it was generally felt that the African American troops were a little lacking in the necessary qualifications of intelligence and background and training to do as well as a corresponding Caucasian.
Almost anything that they did was likely to be severely scrutinized. These men were under enormous pressure.
People who've not traveled into the Northwest of North America have absolutely no idea what the engineers faced in 1942. When they started this construction, they knew virtually nothing about the area. The suggestion that you will build a highway through 1,500 miles of this territory without really understanding what you're doing, and you'll simply say you must get it done in a year, it's an arrogant act in one sense, and it's also a very courageous one.
In the rush to get the Army engineers north, some regiments arrived before their equipment, forcing the men to begin clearing the path by hand. At Charlie Lake, near Fort St. John, British Columbia, officers eager to press ahead decided to ferry some of their construction equipment to a new position.
What they had done, they had constructed a raft type thing. They took two pontons and put a road section between the two pontons. And with that, they could load heavy equipment on it and take it about 12, 14 miles up the lake.
May 15th. Storm clouds menaced over Charlie Lake as the men launched the makeshift raft.
To the people who lived around Charlie Lake, they knew they shouldn't be on the lake when the conditions were like that. And how come the soldiers were allowed to be out on the lake when the conditions were such?
They had a special outfit that's supposed to know what they was doing, but they overloaded these pontoon boats. They had a weapons carrier, and they had a D4 Caterpillar on it and a bunch of food supplies.
I was within 100 yards of the shore of the lake, and somebody came running back up and said something had happened to the units.
A sudden squall had engulfed the barge.
The waves started coming over the front of it, and they turned to go to shore.
One of the Caterpillar tractors, I think, slid sideways a little bit, and it caused it to capsize and turn over, and all of them went down in the lake.
Well, the thing sank in seconds. I mean, it just went right down.
The hypothermia in the first part of May would happen very, very quickly.
A local trapper witnessed the accident and made 3 desperate trips in his rowboat to try and rescue the men.
There were 5 men saved, but there were 12 drowned. It was quite a shock to all of us, and everybody felt bad about it. It was a bad start.
We was out searching for the bodies. It's not a happy thought, but we just went on. That's the way it was.
Two weeks later, on June 3rd, 1942, what Americans had feared since Pearl Harbor became a reality, when the Japanese attacked North America at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. American casualties topped 100.
The Aleutians were a very important part of Alaska for the war. And if you look at a map, you see the Aleutian Islands are separated from the mainland, and they go this way, and it's like a dagger pointing right at Japan. And that's why it was so clear to some of us that the Japanese would come up and try to invade through the Aleutians.
In less than a week, Japan seized 2 islands at the far reaches of the Aleutian chain. Foreign forces had captured American territory for the first time since the War of 1812. With Japanese troops encamped on Alaskan soil, the war in the Pacific had come to the doorstep of North America.
We were afraid that the Japs threw into Alaska. I mean, we didn't know what we were dealing with. Maybe our lives were on the line too.
All of a sudden, they were at the front lines of the war, as opposed to being in the back corner of an international war effort. And it gave them a sense of purpose. They were saving democracy. They were saving North America.
Warmer weather brought new problems for the engineers. Spring rains created miles of mud, and by the start of June, the Corps had completed only 95 miles of road. Plus, major sections of the proposed route for the Alaska Highway crossed large stretches of wet, decayed vegetation called muskeg.
This fella told Sergeant King, "You better watch that muskeg because it'll get you." Sergeant King, he was patting his old 45, and he said, "That's all right." I said, "I got my 45. I'm not afraid of it." We learned what muskeg was for sure, I guarantee you.
Muskeg is basically a frozen wetland. Constructing a muskeg is an extreme challenge. In the wintertime, you can simply run across it. It's frozen, it's hard, it's not too much of a problem. But in the summertime, it starts to thaw and you end up with a large, shallow lake. Think of thawing muskeg as a big sponge. If you put weight on it, the water squishes out and everything sinks, and you end up having a very difficult time getting across that terrain.
The muskeg the engineers encountered ranged from small, shallow bogs to swamps several miles long and over 25 feet deep.
And if you get a tractor in it, it just sit there and vibrate if you leave it running, and it just vibrate till the darn thing buries itself.
As soon as the ground thawed, we really had stick in the mud problems.
Crews used bulldozers and dynamite to clean out shallow sections of muskeg, but deeper pools could swallow the dozers whole. The Corps decided the best way to deal with muskeg was to go around it. Survey teams hugged hillsides and dramatically bent the road in a series of wild zigzags to avoid muskeg bogs.
If you run into conditions that you couldn't go on, you moved right or left, one or the other. You moved.
It looked like we didn't know what we were doing, because sometimes we'd head off one way and then head off another way and finally end up going through the most favorable route. Not the best, but the most favorable.
When the engineers couldn't go around the muskeg, officers ordered the men to corduroy the road.
They laid down trees along the roadway and then put logs across those trees, transverse to the roadway, and then put the fill on top of that. And in effect, it floated the roadway across the muskeg.
laying down corduroy takes an awful lot of labor because it's all hand. You cut the trees down, lug them over, place them in position, and go back and get more trees and do the same thing.
As much as the officers wanted to punch the highway through in a hurry, dealing with muskeg and mud drastically slowed things down. By the end of June, after 3 months of work, the engineers had constructed 360 miles of road. The Army knew it had about 4 months left to build at least 1,100 more miles before winter arrived. In time, aided by a change in season, the outlook for the mission improved. After months of frustrating aerial reconnaissance, a survey team finally had discovered a way through the Canadian Rockies. On the ground, as temperatures rose and the mud began to dry, the engineers picked up the pace. During the month of July, they would blaze over 400 more miles of road.
The greatest problems that the engineers faced on the highway was overcoming nature.
We were in wilderness. That's where the road was. Wilderness, uncharted. Nobody had been there before.
The only thing we saw was nothing but trees. And trees upon trees upon trees. And then be told that you're gonna put a road through that.
A lead bulldozer, flanked by 2 others, tore into the dirt and knocked down trees to create a 60 to 90-foot swath. Behind these front units, the bulk of the regiment widened, straightened, and graded the road, and using the timber at hand, built culverts and bridges.
They basically cleared the vegetation off the roadway, pushed it to the side, and then took the soil alongside the road and pushed it up into the middle and made ditches on each side. Their effort was not to make a full highway, but really more of a trail that was 2 trucks wide, basically, and get it done very quickly.
There were often days where the survey crews would be maybe 10 miles ahead of the first clearing bulldozers, and they would be exploring 2 or 3 possible valleys as to where the road would go, knowing that they had to find a route that could be built because the bulldozers were right behind them and they were not about to stop.
The black soldiers on the highway, who had been written off as careless, shiftless, and irresponsible, held their own.
It was thought that they couldn't learn how to operate complicated construction equipment, like bulldozers and things like that.
We were able to overcome what we did not know by trial and error.
One African-American regiment constructed a 300-foot bridge across the swiftly flowing Sicannie Chief River in just 3.5 days. The bridge would stand longer than any other built that year on the highway. We can't afford to lose our own personal pride, a sergeant said, by slipping up.
They believed in their heart of hearts that by fulfilling this military obligation, when they returned home as civilians, they would be treated differently, their children, their families would have a different life, and all of the hardship and suffering that they experienced would somehow be vindicated.
Work on the road was tough for both black and white troops, and the 20 hours of daylight during the Arctic summer made the job even more exhausting.
I hated it. You didn't have a special time to, not like punching a clock, you know, like 8 hours. You worked until you dropped.
In the summer, the sun was up all the time. We were on 12-hour shifts. Half of the company was in the morning and half at night. We worked all the time, 7 days a week.
We was working so hard that time you got through at night, you roll your sleeping bag out underneath the tree or in the bushes and you crawled in it and sacked out.
Seldom did we ever put a tent up and tie all of the corners together. Usually you put them up and just enough to hold them together because they're only going to be there for the night. The next day the cooks would have to tear them down, load them up, and move them up the road as close to the front as they could move.
It was slave labor is what it was. We weren't prisoners, but wanting to get the job done, we'd done most anything to do it.
You had to do the job. You didn't like it.
Cakes 3 times a day there for about a month.
At the cat camp, we had to carry our lunch with us. The cooks never got to us. We mainly had World War I rations that come in a little tin can. We didn't have to worry about doing any dieting.
We got so sick and tired of the chili con, we would send truckloads of chili con down to the Indian village and trade it off for fish. And they said, we trade, but no more chili con. They got tired of it themselves.
Like most things on the highway, personal hygiene was an improvisation.
God, you should have seen some of the tubs that they made out of 50-gallon drums and things like that, because we didn't have any bathrooms or anything like that, you know.
We bathed in some of the streams too, but I'll tell you, that water was cold.
Summer brought more challenges. Temperatures soared into the 90s, dust clouds choked the air, and then came the season's most hated enemy, mosquitoes.
There was just droves of them come in clouds. We were issued those campaign hats with the brims like so and pulled the nets down over them and fastened them around your neck. If you didn't have a mosquito net on, you'd get bites all over you.
You had mosquitoes that dive bombed you. They dive like the Japanese with the dive bomb, and they dive and hit you. That's true.
You couldn't fight them off. There's no way. The mosquitoes just eat you up. You'd have just been welts all over your body. You couldn't take a shirt off. You couldn't even roll your sleeves up. The palms of the gloves were wore out. You still wore them because keep your back of your hands from being bitten.
Far away from towns, with few opportunities for leave, the men also fought the pain of isolation.
There was nobody. There was absolutely nobody. As far as young sweetie pies up there, we never seen a lady. In fact, it's probably a good thing there wasn't any up there.
I got married while I was in the service, and I wanted to get back to my wife. Now, why would I want to be up there into the wilderness, you know? Nothing up there to see. Let's face it.
We were completely isolated in most cases. At the beginning, we were near some Indian villages, but most of the time, we were completely isolated.
The importance of this need to hold on to Alaska had precedence over everything else. It overcame the isolation, the long hours, the tedium of repetition, day after day of doing the same thing.
War raged in the South Pacific throughout the summer of 1942. In battle after battle, American losses mounted. With Japanese forces still lodged in the Aleutians, the threat to North America remained close at hand.
We had to head them Japs off, and in order to do it, we had to keep the tractors going as much as we could. We had to get it through.
Now that it had a promising amount of road completed, the War Department decided to show off the highway. For the first time, reporters were allowed to visit the restricted military project. Americans began reading about the Alaska-Canada Highway, ALCAN for short, and the heroic engineers who were waging a war in the woods to defend the nation.
"1942 was not a great year for the U.S. Army. But one thing it could do, and could do very well, was to conquer the North American wilderness. So putting through a highway was important to the nation in maintaining morale.
The August 31st edition of Time magazine hyped the highway as a job for Paul Bunyan. But in reality, the project was stalled. With 460 miles left to go, a new problem made it unlikely the road would be finished before winter. The engineers had struck permafrost.
Permafrost is simply ground that's been frozen 2 or more years. The temperature of the permafrost was about 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And when the Corps of Engineers removed the vegetation off the ground, they found a hard surface, but it changed the surface temperature of about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it was now above the freezing temperature and then thawed very rapidly. And as it thawed, it changed in character from a hard surface for them to drive on to mud, and which they, of course, got stuck.
The road building method that had allowed the engineers to build over 800 miles in 2 months suddenly had failed them. Work on the northern portion of the highway stopped.
The engineers and construction workers entered the far northwest in a state of incredible naivete. Very few people had any experience with constructing highways in cold weather areas. The scientific information on building across permafrost, virtually non-existent.
The Army engineers scrambled to find a solution. Since they could not go around the permafrost, they needed to keep the ground frozen. It took them 6 weeks of trial and error to figure out how to deal with permafrost. To protect the ground, the engineers decided to sideline the bulldozers as they cut down trees by hand to immediately insulate the surface with corduroy.
The Army engineers were problem solvers. In combat, you have to come up with a solution to whatever problem you're facing very quickly and efficiently in order to move the war effort forward. They had not known about permafrost, but they were able to adapt what they knew to the problem at hand.
The solution worked, but reduced construction to only a mile a day. At the start of October, the temperature began to drop sharply. Permafrost was no longer their biggest problem. What would be one of the coldest winters on record had arrived. With only 166 miles left, 2 regiments, one black, one white, struggled to close the last gap of the highway.
Working in the cold climates, 40 and 50 below zero, is always a very real challenge. Anytime you're working in the cold, men and equipment move slower, the logistics become more difficult. The metals that they had at 40 below zero became very brittle and broke very, very easily.
The equipment that we had was not designed for sub-zero weather. Trucks we had to keep running 24 hours a day. If you didn't, you'd have to get underneath a truck with a blowtorch and heat up the transmission and the rear axle before it would move.
At 40 below zero, skin froze in a matter of seconds.
It was actually a fight for survival. On one case, I spilled some gasoline on my clothing. It evaporated, and when I went to pull my coat off, it pulled the flesh off, too.
Minor mistakes can be deadly. If your vehicle breaks down in the Arctic, walking a few miles can actually cost you your life.
Mile by mile, the 2 regiments pressed on. Each day, their bulldozers growled closer and closer. At 4 p.m. on October 25th, just south of the Alaska-Canada border, the engineers closed the last gap of the highway. In less than 8 months, the United States Army Corps of Engineers had conquered a forbidding wilderness and built the first overland route from the continental United States to Alaska Territory. The 1,500-mile military supply line was hailed as an unprecedented engineering feat.
The Alaskan Highway is dedicated at Soldiers Summit, Yukon Territory, by officials of the United States and Canada. Completed with amazing...
The building of the Alaska Highway represented one of the great triumphs of the U.S. Army in 1942.
And they made sure that everybody across North America heard about it. It was in the newsreels, it was on the radio programs, it was in the newspapers. The American Army was trying to send messages of reassurance and messages to the enemy: we're serious about this. We will do anything we absolutely have to do.
Just after the final gap was closed, the Army restaged the historic meeting of the 2 lead bulldozer drivers, a black corporal from Pennsylvania and a white private from Texas. Within 4 months, the military would splash the photograph across the pages of Yank, the Army Weekly, in an article glorifying the achievements of the African-American engineers.
And we did it in record time before they said we could do it. For the most part, the men in my outfit couldn't read or write. And they said they couldn't use heavy equipment. But these men became experts at heavy machinery.
They did work that nobody thought they could do, in an area nobody thought they could survive. They had shown to the American Army they could do almost anything that they were asked to do.
This was intended to be a morale booster, particularly for black troops. To send a signal that blacks were doing some things that others thought that they couldn't do, and yes, it was helping win the war.
The Army and the nation was attempting to mobilize the entire population. They could make it clear to the American people that the only way, the best way to win this war, certainly, was for all Americans to join hands and get in the fight together.
By the time the engineers completed their work on the highway, the war in the Pacific was turning in favor of America and its allies. In the summer of 1943, U.S. forces drove the Japanese out of the Aleutian Islands. Japan never advanced to Alaska's mainland. But the Alaska Highway did play a vital role in World War II. Nearly 8,000 Lend-Lease aircraft, flown from America to Russia by means of the highway and northwest staging route, helped the Soviet Union triumph over Germany. Fierce battles in Europe and the Pacific soon overshadowed the building of the Alaska Highway. By war's end, it was all but forgotten.
I took a part in building what was considered one of the greatest engineering projects during the last century. Some people said it was second only to the Panama Canal to build 1,500 miles of road in 8 months.
What we went through, you actually had nightmares of the cold and stuff like that, you know. I used to complain it was a waste of time. I finally got back to see what we actually made, and it was altogether different. All that cussing at nights and stuff like that went out the window because we did a beautiful job. It's beautiful.
There's more about building the Alaska Highway at American Experience Online. Explore Yukon geology, see a timeline of Alaska history, and learn more about the highway builders. All this and more at pbs.org. To order Building the Alaska Highway on video cassette or DVD, or other programs from American Experience, call 1-800-PLAY-PBS. Next time on American Experience. American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
At Liberty Mutual Insurance, we do everything we can to help prevent accidents and make America a safer place. Liberty Mutual is proud to support American Experience.
At the Scotts Company, we help make gardens more beautiful, lawns greener, trees taller. If there's a better business to be in, please let us know.
American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
We are PBS.
He took on America for us.
A century after slavery, he still fought for freedom.
By any means necessary.
On the 40th anniversary of his assassination, see the Emmy and Peabody Award-winning portrait of one of America's most complex figures.
Do you consider yourself militant? I consider myself Malcolm.
Malcolm X, Make It Plain. In 2 weeks on American Experience.
Broadcast of The American Experience on Vermont Public Television is supported in part by the Vermont Health Plan, taking steps to bring better health care to all Vermonters and create healthier communities throughout our state. By Otter Creek Awnings and Patio Rooms, specializing in the art of outdoor living and relaxation, offering custom-crafted awnings and sunrooms to distinguishing homeowners throughout Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York for over 25 years. This program is also supported by contributing members like you. You're watching viewer-supported Vermont Public Television, where you belong.
Hi, I'm Leanne Lee. At Vermont Public Television, learning never ends. And with that in mind, we are planning another tour, and you're invited. Departing on May 7th, we'll be taking an exciting springtime tour of Portugal, a magical land of fado music, ancient cities, and the most welcoming people in Europe. From Lisbon to the sunny Algarve region, we'll experience all that Portugal has to offer. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and we'd love to have you join us. Our tour departs May 7th. If you'd like to reserve a space or get more information, call me, Leanne Lee, at 802-654-3669. You won't want to miss it.
Next time on Nova, a detective story that rocked the scientific world for decades. A Viking map that could prove that Columbus wasn't the first to discover America.
If it's a fake, it was done by a master.
The Viking Deception.
Tune in Tuesday at 9, here on VPT.
Next time on Frontline, a strategic alliance.
America struck a pact with Saudi Arabia.
Built on trust.
You give us oil and we will give you protection.
And suspicion.
When it became clear that 15 of the 19 were Saudis, bin Laden had made Saudi Arabia into an enemy.
With unprecedented access, Frontline tells the story of America's uneasy alliance with the House of Saud.
Tune in Tuesday night at 10 on Vermont Public Television.
Coming up on this episode of Antiques Roadshow FYI, love is in the air.
These are traditionally known as sailors' valentines.
Join us for a special romance-filled edition of Antiques Roadshow FYI.
Don't miss it Wednesday night at 8 on Vermont Public Television.
Broadcast of Nightly Business Report on Vermont Public Television is supported in part by Standard Radio Montreal's Talk Rock Hot radio stations, CJAD 800, Shome 97.7, Mix 96, by Merchants Bank, Vermont's community bank, providing banking solutions to individuals and businesses. This program is also supported by contributing members like you.
Uncle Sam's budget goes by the book. These books, in fact. In them are details of President Bush's $2.5 trillion spending plan for 2006, boosting military.
The minds and enrich the lives of all members of the community. And by Irving Woodlands, seeing the forest for more than just trees, a team dedicated to sustainable forest management in Maine.
Looking for easy-to-use lesson plans?
Major funding for production of Quest, Investigating Our World on the Maine Public Broadcasting Network, is provided by the National Science Foundation. Additional support is provided by gifts to More Connected, More Maine, the campaign for Maine Public Broadcasting's programming, by Desiree Carlson, M.D., in honor of Maine Public Broadcasting's commitment to engage the minds and enrich the lives of all members of the community. And by Irving Woodlands, seeing the forest for more than just trees, a team dedicated to sustainable forest management in Maine.
Looking for easy-to-use lesson plans? Go to the Quest website at mainepbs.org.
Financial support for the programming on Vermont Public Television comes from VPT members like you, and by Union Mutual Fire Insurance Company and New England Guarantee, providing personal and commercial lines insurance with over 125 years of service throughout New England.
Next time on Frontline, these are the Men of Dog Company.
When the war kicked off, I was still in high school.
Stationed on the southern banks of the Tigris River.
My job's not to die for my country. My job's to make the other poor bastard die for his country.
This is their story.
Are you okay, Garcia? Got hit, came back up, mortally wounded. He went out fighting, and he died like he should.
A company of soldiers. Watch Frontline.
Be with us tonight at 10 on VPT.
On Thursday, February 24th, Vermont Public Television brings you live coverage as the University of Vermont men's basketball team plays its final home game of the season, hosting the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. This is also the final home game for UVM seniors Taylor Koppenrath and TJ Sorrentine and retiring coach Tom Brennan. Don't miss the final home game live from UVM's Patrick Gym, Thursday, February 24th at 7, only on Vermont Public Television.
Ever want to go back in time to live in the Old West? Here's your chance. From the makers of Frontier House and Colonial House comes Texas Ranch House. Whether you're a city slicker or an old cowhand, pull on your boots and sign up at pbs.org.
It may be the dead of winter, but here at VP
Broadcast support for NOVA is provided in part by Vermont Yankee, providing the electrical energy that Vermonters have relied upon for more than a quarter century. By the Fuel and Utility Systems Division of Goodrich Corporation in Vergennes, a significant contributor to education in Vermont for more than 50 years. By radios WDEV, AM 550 and FM 96.1. WDEV, locally owned radio serving Vermonters for over 70 years. Additional funding is provided by contributing Vermont Public Television members like you.
Nearly a century ago, an event took place that changed our sense of time, of space, of our place on the earth. The year is 1909, not quite 6 years after the invention of the airplane. Louis Blériot, a French aviator, sets out to do what no one has done before: to cross from France to Britain over the English Channel, an expanse of water that had held Napoleon at bay. It's a dangerous flight. The crossing stretches the airplane's technology to its limits.
This thing flies like a leaf. It's not an airplane. It's just a kind of a motorized kite. Taking a kite like that across the channel, it's just like landing on the moon.
36 minutes after takeoff, Blériot stands on Britain's shore.
Even from today's vantage point, it's still one of the great events, one of the most significant events in the history of flight.
Blériot has done more than cross the channel. He has shown the world the potential of powered flight and made Paris the capital of aviation. The flight is remembered as heroic and terribly dangerous. Nevertheless, the grandson who carries Louis Blériot's name readies an attempt to repeat his in a vintage Model 11.
No. No matter the year, it's still a Blériot 11. Doesn't fly better. It's not like wine, doesn't age well. And so it's dangerous. It's bloody dangerous.